My daughter showed up at home covered in bruises. When I found out her husband was the culprit, we made a plan. She lured him to a meeting, but I was the one who showed up in her place. To teach him a lesson he would never forget. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I'm James, and at 61 years old, I thought I had seen everything life could throw at me. 25 years in the military, 2 tours overseas, raising a daughter as a single father after my wife passed when Haley was just 12. I believed I could handle anything, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I discovered about my daughter's marriage. It started with small things that didn't sit right with me. Haley had always been the type to call me 3 times a week, sometimes more. We talk about everything from her job at the local elementary school to her weekend plans. But over the past 6 months, those calls had become sporadic, then forced, then almost non-existent. When she did call, her voice sounded different. Strained. Like she was reading from a script with someone listening in the background. I'd ask her direct questions about her life, and she'd give me these vague, rehearsed answers that made my gut twist with concern. The first real warning sign came on a Tuesday evening in October. I was in my workshop, sanding down an old rocking chair I was restoring for a neighbor when my phone rang. Haley's name flashed on the screen, but when I answered, all I heard was muffled crying. "Haley, what's wrong, sweetheart?" There was a long pause, then sniffling. "Nothing, Dad. I just wanted to hear your voice." That wasn't my daughter. Haley had always been direct, even as a child. If something was bothering her, she'd tell me straight up. This evasive, frightened version of her voice sent alarm bells ringing in my head. "Are you sure you're okay? You sound upset." "I'm fine, really. I should go. Martin will be home soon, and dinner isn't ready." The way she said it, like she was afraid of what would happen if dinner wasn't on the table when Martin arrived, made my blood run cold. But before I could press further, she hung up. I tried calling back immediately. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again an hour later. Same thing. For 3 days my calls went unanswered. When she finally called me back, she acted like nothing had happened, but there was still that strain in her voice, that careful way of speaking that told me she was walking on eggshells. The second warning sign came 3 weeks later. I had driven over to their house unannounced, something I rarely did because Martin had made it clear early in their relationship that he valued their privacy. But my instincts were screaming that something was wrong, and I'd learned to trust those instincts during my years in the service. I knocked on the front door and waited. I could hear movement inside, hushed voices, then footsteps. When the door finally opened, Haley stood there wearing a long-sleeved shirt despite the fact that it was nearly 80 degrees outside. "Dad, what are you doing here?" She seemed genuinely surprised, but also nervous, glancing over her shoulder like she was checking to see if anyone was watching. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. Can I come in?" She hesitated for just a moment too long. "Of course. Sorry, you just caught me off guard." As I stepped inside, I noticed she was favoring her left side slightly, the way people do when their ribs are sore. When I hugged her, she winced, just barely, but I caught it. Years of treating wounded soldiers had taught me to notice these things. "Everything all right, honey? You seem a little stiff." "Oh, I just pulled something at the gym yesterday. You know how clumsy I can be." But Haley had never been clumsy. She'd been a star athlete in high school, coordinated and graceful. And the gym excuse didn't sit right with me either. She'd never mentioned joining a gym before. We sat in the living room and I watched her carefully. She kept adjusting her sleeves, pulling them down to cover her wrists. Her hair was styled differently too, swept forward to partially cover her face in a way that seemed deliberate rather than fashionable. When Martin came home 20 minutes later, the entire atmosphere in the house changed. Haley immediately tensed, sitting up straighter, her hands clasping together in her lap, like a child who'd been caught doing something wrong. "James," Martin said with that fake smile he'd perfected, the one that never reached his eyes. "What a surprise. Haley didn't mention you were coming by." "It was spontaneous," I replied, studying his face. "Just wanted to check in on my daughter." "Well, that's sweet, but we actually have plans tonight, don't we, babe?" He looked at Haley expectantly, and I watched her nod quickly. "Yes, we're having dinner with Martin's colleagues. I should start getting ready soon. I stood up, but not before I caught sight of something that made my stomach drop. As Haley reached for her water glass, her sleeve rolled up slightly, revealing a dark purple bruise on her wrist. The size and shape were unmistakable to someone who'd seen enough injuries in his lifetime. Those were finger marks. The third and final warning sign came just a week later, and it was the one that shattered any remaining doubt I had about what was happening to my daughter. I was doing my weekly grocery shopping when I spotted Haley's car in the parking lot of the medical center across the street. It was unusual because she'd never mentioned having an appointment, and she usually told me about those things. Something compelled me to wait to see if she was okay. 20 minutes later, she emerged from the building, moving slowly, carefully, like every step hurt. She was wearing sunglasses despite the overcast day, and she had that same long-sleeved shirt pulled up high around her neck. I followed her car from a distance, something that went against every instinct I had about respecting my daughter's privacy. But my parental instincts were stronger. She didn't go home. Instead, she drove to the old park where we used to go when she was little, the one with the pond where we'd feed the ducks. She sat in her car for nearly an hour, just staring at the water. Even from where I was parked, I could see her shoulders shaking. She was crying. The kind of deep, silent sobbing that comes from someone who's completely alone and scared. That's when I knew. That's when every protective instinct I'd developed as a father and a soldier kicked into high gear. My daughter was being hurt, systematically and deliberately, by the man she'd married. The man she'd trusted with her life. I drove home that night with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. The rage building inside me was unlike anything I'd felt since the war, but this was different. This was personal. This was my child, the little girl who used to fall asleep on my chest while I read her bedtime stories, who trusted me to protect her from everything bad in the world. And I had failed her. She was suffering, probably had been for months, and she felt like she couldn't even tell me about it. But that was about to change. Because Martin had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He'd hurt my daughter, and he was about to learn exactly what happened to people who made that particular error in judgment. The next few weeks were the longest of my life. I had to act normal, pretend I didn't know what was happening, while every fiber of my being screamed at me to confront Martin directly. But 25 years in the military had taught me patience, strategy, and the importance of knowing your enemy before making a move. So I watched. I studied. I learned everything I could about Martin Caldwell, the man who was systematically destroying my daughter's life. I started by sitting in my truck outside the accounting firm where Martin worked. I told myself I was just trying to understand his daily routine, but really, I was trying to understand him. How does someone become the kind of man who hits women? What kind of person looks at someone they're supposed to love and chooses to hurt them? Martin left work every day at exactly 5:30. Not 5:25, not 5:35. 5:30 on the dot. He drove a silver sedan that he kept meticulously clean, and he always stopped at the same gas station on his way home to buy a pack of cigarettes and an energy drink, the same brand, every single day. I followed him to a bar called Murphy's on Thursday nights, where he'd sit alone for exactly 1 hour, drinking 2 beers and watching whatever sport was on the television. He never talked to anyone unless they spoke to him first, and even then, his responses were curt, dismissive. He had the demeanor of someone who thought he was better than everyone around him. But it was watching him at home that really opened my eyes to who Martin truly was. I parked across the street from their house one Saturday morning, hidden behind a large oak tree, and watched through binoculars as Martin worked in their front yard. When Haley came outside to bring him a glass of water, I saw it happen. She approached him carefully, almost apologetically, holding the glass out like an offering. Martin looked at her for a long moment, then said something that made her entire body tense. He didn't take the water. Instead, he said something else, his voice low but clearly angry based on his body language. Haley's shoulders slumped and she turned to go back inside. That's when Martin grabbed her arm, not gently, and pulled her back. From my position across the street, I could see him speaking to her in sharp, controlled bursts, his face inches from hers. Haley nodded rapidly, like she was agreeing to whatever demands he was making. When he finally let go of her arm, she practically ran back to the house. Martin went back to his yard work like nothing had happened, but I could see the satisfied smirk on his face. He enjoyed having that power over her. He got off on making her afraid. The most disturbing observation came 3 days later when I saw them together at the grocery store. I was 2 aisles over, pretending to study pasta sauce labels, when I heard Martin's voice cutting through the ambient noise of the store. "I told you to get the wheat bread, not white. Do you ever listen to anything I say?" "I'm sorry, I thought you said white bread. Let me go change it." "Don't bother. We'll just add it to the list of things you screwed up this week." I peered around the corner and watched as Haley's face crumpled slightly before she forced it back into a neutral expression. Martin continued talking to her in that same condescending tone, criticizing her choices, questioning her intelligence, making her defend herself over bread. But what struck me most was how she responded. My daughter, who had once been confident enough to argue with her high school principal about an unfair grade, who had stood up to bullies who picked on smaller kids, was now apologizing for existing. She was constantly saying sorry, constantly looking to Martin for approval before making the smallest decisions. He had broken her spirit systematically, probably over months or years, until she genuinely believed that everything wrong in their relationship was her fault. That night I did something I never thought I'd do. I called my old friend Danny, who now worked as a private investigator. I needed to know more about Martin's history, needed to understand if this was a pattern or if my daughter was his first victim. "Danny, I need a favor, and I need it kept quiet." "What kind of favor, James?" "Background check, deep dive. Guy named Martin Caldwell works at Henderson and Associates accounting firm. I need to know everything about him, especially his relationship history." Danny was quiet for a moment. "This about Haley?" I'd known Danny since basic training. He could read people like books, and he'd always been protective of Haley since she was little. "Yeah, it's about Haley." "And Danny? Time is important here. I'll have something for you by tomorrow night." The file Danny brought me the next evening was thicker than I'd expected, and every page made my blood run colder. Martin had been engaged once before to a woman named Sarah Chen. The engagement had ended abruptly, and Sarah had moved to another state immediately afterward. Danny had managed to track her down and convince her to talk off the record. Sarah's story was sickeningly familiar. It had started with small criticisms, little comments about her appearance, her job performance, her friends. Then came the isolation, subtle at first, then more aggressive. Martin would create conflicts with her family, make her feel guilty for spending time with friends, convince her that he was the only person who really understood her. Then came the physical abuse. A shove here, a grabbed wrist there, always followed by apologies and promises that it would never happen again. Until it did happen again, and again, each time a little worse than the last. Sarah had finally escaped when Martin threw her down a flight of stairs during an argument about her wanting to visit her sick mother. She'd spent 4 days in the hospital with a concussion and 2 broken ribs. When she was released, she packed everything she could fit in her car and drove straight to her brother's house in Oregon. She'd been there ever since, too afraid to come back to Texas. The pattern was identical to what I was seeing with Haley. Martin was methodical, calculated. This wasn't about anger management or stress from work. This was about control, about finding women who were kind and trusting and systematically breaking them down until they became shadows of themselves. But there was something else in the file that caught my attention. 3 restraining orders filed against Martin over the past 8 years, all by different women, all eventually dropped when the women moved away or stopped pursuing the cases. Danny had included a note that 2 of the women had been contacted but refused to speak on the record, clearly still afraid of him even years later. This man was a predator, plain and simple, and predators don't stop hunting unless they're stopped. I closed the file and sat in my living room staring at the photos of Haley that covered my mantelpiece. Pictures of her graduation, her first day as a teacher, her wedding day where she'd looked so happy and hopeful. Martin had stolen all of that from her, piece by piece, until she was afraid to even call her own father without checking with him first. The rage I felt wasn't the hot, impulsive anger that makes people do stupid things. This was cold, calculating fury, the kind that had kept me alive in combat situations where thinking clearly was the difference between coming home and not coming home. Martin thought he was smart, thought he'd found another victim he could control and terrorize without consequences. He'd chosen wrong this time. He'd hurt the one person in the world I would do anything to protect, and he was about to learn what happened when you made an enemy of someone who had spent decades learning how to eliminate threats. But I needed more than just knowledge. I needed an opportunity, a way to get Martin alone where there would be no witnesses, no interruptions, no chance for him to run or call for help. I needed him to make a mistake, to give me the opening I was looking for. And based on everything I'd learned about his psychology, his need to control and dominate, I was betting that opportunity would come sooner rather than later. Men like Martin always escalated. They pushed boundaries until someone pushed back, and when that someone was me, he was going to discover that some people push back harder than he ever imagined possible. The call came on a Thursday evening while I was cleaning my rifle in the garage. I'd been maintaining my weapons more frequently lately, partly out of habit, but mostly because it helped me think clearly about what needed to be done. When my phone rang and I saw Haley's name, I answered immediately, but what I heard on the other end made my blood turn to ice. She was crying. Not the quiet, controlled tears I'd witnessed before, but the raw, panicked sobs of someone who was genuinely terrified. Dad, I need help." I set down the cleaning cloth and gripped the phone tighter. "What happened, sweetheart? Where are you?" "I'm in my car, parked at the 24-hour diner on Maple Street. I can't go home, Dad. I can't face him right now." "Face who?" "Martin. Haley, what did he do to you?" There was a long pause filled only with her shaky breathing. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "He found out I went to the doctor last week. He went through my purse and found the paperwork. He's furious because I didn't tell him, because the doctor asked questions about my injuries. He thinks I told them about him." My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles were white. "Did you tell them about him?" "No. I made up some story about falling down the stairs just like always. But Martin doesn't believe me. He says I'm trying to embarrass him, trying to make him look bad. He's been screaming at me for 2 hours, calling me names, throwing things. I had to get out of there. I was already grabbing my keys, heading for my truck. "Stay where you are, I'm coming to get you. We're going to figure this out together." "No, Dad, you can't. If Martin finds out I called you, if he thinks I'm talking to people about our marriage, he'll—" She trailed off, but I could hear the fear in her voice. "He'll what, Haley?" Another long pause. "He said if I ever embarrassed him again, if I ever made him look bad to other people, he'd make sure I regretted it for the rest of my life." And Dad, the way he said it, the look in his eyes. I believe him. I was backing out of my driveway now, phone pressed to my ear, every protective instinct I had screaming at me to get to my daughter as fast as possible. "Listen to me very carefully, Haley. That man does not get to threaten you. He does not get to control you with fear. You are my daughter, and I will not let anyone hurt you. You don't understand, Dad. He's not like other people. When he gets angry, really angry, there's something wrong with his eyes, like he's not even human anymore. He enjoys it. He enjoys making me scared." Those words hit me like a physical blow. My daughter was living with a monster, and she was so beaten down that she thought it was normal, that she deserved it somehow. Where is he now? Still at the house, I think. He was drinking when I left, getting angrier and angrier. He kept saying I was going to pay for disrespecting him, that he was going to teach me a lesson I'd never forget. The predator in Martin was escalating, just like I'd expected. Men like him always pushed until they went too far, until they made the kind of mistakes that gave people like me the opportunity we were waiting for. "Haley, I want you to drive to my house right now. Stay there tonight. Tomorrow we're going to deal with this properly." "I can't, Dad. He'll expect me to come home. If I don't show up, he'll come looking for me, and if he finds me at your house." "Then let him come. I've been waiting for an excuse to have a conversation with Martin." "No." Her voice was sharp with panic. "You don't know what he's capable of. He's already told me what will happen if my family gets involved in our marriage. Please, Dad, I just need to think. I need to figure out what to say to him when I go back." That's when it hit me. She was planning to go back. After everything he'd done to her, after the threats and the fear and the systematic destruction of her self-worth, she was still planning to go home to him. "Haley, listen to me. You are not going back to that house tonight. You're coming to stay with me, and tomorrow we're going to contact the police." "The police won't help, Dad. I don't have any proof. The bruises are mostly healed, and I've never reported anything before. It would just be my word against his, and Martin is very good at making people believe he's the victim." She was right, and we both knew it. Domestic abuse cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute, especially when the victim had been conditioned to protect their abuser, to take responsibility for the violence inflicted on them. But there was another way, a more direct approach that didn't rely on courts or lawyers or systems that were designed to give predators like Martin every possible advantage. Haley, what if I told you there was a way to make sure Martin never hurt you again? A way to make sure he understood that touching you would have consequences he couldn't escape. Dad, what are you talking about? I pulled into the diner parking lot and spotted her car immediately. She was slumped over the steering wheel, phone pressed to her ear, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd seen her since she was a child. We'll talk about it inside. Come on, let's get you some coffee and figure this out together. 20 minutes later, we were sitting across from each other in a corner booth, 2 cups of coffee growing cold between us while I studied my daughter's face in the harsh fluorescent light. The bruises were fading but still visible if you knew what to look for. A yellowish mark along her jawline, the remnants of finger-shaped bruises on her wrist, the way she held her left side like her ribs were still tender. Tell me everything, Haley. From the beginning. When did this start? She stared into her coffee cup for a long time before speaking. It was so gradual at first. He'd criticize little things, make me feel like I was always doing something wrong. Then he started getting angry when I talked to my friends, said they were filling my head with ideas about how relationships should work. Before I knew it, I was making excuses not to see them, not to call you as much. And the physical abuse? Her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around the coffee mug. The first time was about 8 months ago. I had made plans to have lunch with my friend Sarah without asking him first. When I got home, he was furious. He said I was disrespectful, that I was acting like I was single instead of married. When I tried to explain, he grabbed my arm and shook me. Hard. Left bruises that lasted for weeks. What did you do? I convinced myself it was my fault, that I should have asked him before making plans, that I had been inconsiderate. He was so apologetic afterward, brought me flowers, promised it would never happen again. I wanted to believe him. But it did happen again. She nodded, tears starting to flow again. It got worse each time. A push here, a slap there, always followed by apologies and promises. But recently the apologies have stopped. Now he just acts like I deserved it, like I brought it on myself. I leaned forward, keeping my voice low and steady. Haley, what if I told you that Martin called you tonight? What if he said he wanted to meet you somewhere to talk things over, to work out your problems? She looked at me with confusion. He hasn't called me. My phone's been silent since I left the house. But what if he did? What if he suggested meeting at the old warehouse district, somewhere private where you could talk without interruptions? Understanding slowly dawned in her eyes. Dad, what are you planning? I reached across the table and took her hands in hers, mine. They were shaking, cold despite the warmth of the coffee mug she'd been holding. I'm planning to have a conversation with your husband. The kind of conversation that will help him understand exactly what happens to men who hurt my daughter. You can't. If something happens to Martin, if he gets hurt, the police will know it was you. I won't let you ruin your life trying to fix mine. Sweetheart, you let me worry about the consequences. The only thing I need from you is a phone call. One phone call to Martin telling him you want to meet somewhere to talk. Can you do that for me? She was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the empty parking lot. When she finally looked back at me, something had changed in her expression. The fear was still there, but underneath it I could see a spark of the strong, determined woman I'd raised. The old Riverside warehouse, she said quietly. It's where he takes me sometimes when he wants to scream at me without the neighbors hearing. He'll know exactly where I mean. Perfect. Call him now. Tell him you're sorry, that you want to make things right. But you need to talk somewhere private first. Tell him to meet you there in 2 hours. As Haley dialed Martin's number with shaking fingers, I felt a cold calm settle over me. The trap was being set, and Martin was about to walk right into it. He thought he was meeting a broken, apologetic wife who would submit to whatever punishment he had planned. Instead, he was going to meet me, and I was going to teach him exactly what happened to predators who made the mistake of hunting in my family. The conversation was brief. Martin was initially angry that she'd left the house, but when Haley used the submissive, apologetic tone he'd trained her to use, his attitude shifted to satisfaction. Yes, he'd meet her at the warehouse. Yes, they needed to have a serious conversation about her behavior. And yes, she was going to learn some important lessons about respect and obedience. As she hung up the phone, Haley looked at me with a mixture of terror and hope. "He'll be there in 2 hours. Dad, are you sure about this?" I squeezed her hand one more time before standing up. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Go to my house, lock the doors, and wait for me to call you. By tomorrow morning, Martin will never be a threat to you again." I drove home from the diner with the methodical calmness that had kept me alive through 2 combat tours. There was no room for emotion now, no space for the rage that had been building for weeks. This was an operation, pure and simple, and operations required clear thinking, proper preparation, and absolute commitment to the objective. The objective was simple: ensure that Martin Caldwell never hurt my daughter again. Back in my garage, I opened the metal cabinet where I kept my gear. Most people my age had toolboxes filled with wrenches and screwdrivers. Mine contained items from a different kind of life. Tactical gloves, sturdy boots that wouldn't leave distinctive prints, clothing that wouldn't tear or restrict movement. I dressed deliberately, each piece of equipment chosen for a specific purpose. I checked my watch. 1 hour and 15 minutes until Martin arrived at the warehouse. Plenty of time to get there early, assess the terrain, and position myself properly. In the military we had a saying: proper preparation prevents poor performance. Tonight there could be no poor performance. The Riverside warehouse district had been abandoned for nearly 5 years, a casualty of economic downturn and shifting industry. It was the perfect location for what Martin had been doing to my daughter, isolated enough that no one would hear her crying or pleading. Tonight it would serve a different purpose. I arrived 45 minutes early and parked my truck 3 blocks away, approaching the area on foot through the shadows cast by broken streetlights. The warehouse Martin had chosen was a concrete structure with high windows and multiple entrances, surrounded by weeds and debris. I could see why he'd selected it. No witnesses, no security cameras, no chance of interruption. But what made it perfect for Martin's purposes also made it perfect for mine. I circled the building twice, noting every entrance, every window, every possible escape route. The main door was partially ajar, hanging on rusted hinges. The loading dock on the east side was accessible, but the metal door was secured. 2 windows on the north wall were broken out, offering alternative entry points if needed. Inside the warehouse was a cavern of shadows and echoes. Broken pallets were scattered across the concrete floor, along with old machinery covered in dust and rust. The air smelled of decay and abandonment, with an underlying chemical tang that suggested this place had been used for purposes beyond legitimate business. I positioned myself near the rear of the building, behind a stack of old shipping containers that provided cover while still allowing me to observe the main entrance. From here I could see Martin when he arrived, could watch his body language, assess his mental state before making my presence known. At exactly 9:30, headlights swept across the broken windows as Martin's silver sedan pulled into the parking area outside. I watched through a gap in the containers as he sat in his car for several minutes, engine running. He was scanning the area, looking for signs of Haley's presence, probably savoring the anticipation of whatever he had planned for her. When he finally got out of the car, I could see the predator in his movements. He walked with the confident swagger of someone who believed he held all the power, who thought he was meeting a broken victim who would submit to whatever punishment he had designed. His hands were clenched at his sides, and even from a distance I could see the tension in his shoulders that suggested barely controlled rage. Martin approached the warehouse entrance slowly, calling out in a voice that dripped with false concern and genuine threat. "Haley! Are you in there, baby? Come on out so we can talk about this like adults." He stepped through the doorway and I could hear his footsteps echoing in the empty space as he moved deeper into the building. "I know you're scared, honey, but running away just made things worse. We need to discuss your behavior tonight. Need to make sure you understand why what you did was so wrong." His voice was getting closer to my position now. I could hear the satisfaction in his tone, the anticipation of someone who enjoyed inflicting fear and pain on others. This was probably how he'd spoken to Sarah Chen, to the other women who'd filed restraining orders against him. The voice of a predator who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. You know I love you, Haley, but love means discipline sometimes. It means helping you understand when you've made mistakes so you won't make them again. I stepped out from behind the shipping containers, moving silently across the concrete floor until I was directly behind him. Martin was still calling for Haley, still moving forward with that confident stride, still completely unaware that the balance of power in this situation had shifted dramatically. "She's not coming, Martin." He spun around so fast he nearly lost his balance, eyes wide with shock and confusion. For a moment he didn't speak, just stared at me like his brain couldn't process what he was seeing. "James, what are you doing here? Where's Haley?" I took a step closer and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not fear yet, but uncertainty. The predator was realizing that this wasn't the scenario he'd planned for. "Haley's safe. She's somewhere, you will never hurt her again." Martin's confusion quickly shifted to anger. "What the hell is going on here? I'm supposed to meet my wife, not her father. This is none of your business, old man. When you put your hands on my daughter, you made it my business." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. Martin's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, denial, anger, and finally calculation. I could see him trying to figure out how much I knew, how much Haley had told me. "I don't know what lies she's been filling your head with, but Haley and I have a good marriage. Sometimes couples have disagreements, but that's between a husband and wife. It's not something for outsiders to get involved in." "Disagreements?" I took another step forward, and this time Martin instinctively stepped back. "Is that what you call throwing my daughter downstairs? Grabbing her hard enough to leave finger-shaped bruises on her arms? Making her so afraid that she jumps every time a door slams?" Martin's mask was slipping now. The false concern was being replaced by something colder, more honest. "You don't know anything about marriage, James? You couldn't even keep your own wife alive, could you? Maybe if you'd been a better husband, Haley would have learned how to be a better wife." The comment about my deceased wife was meant to provoke me, to make me lose control and do something stupid. It was the kind of psychological manipulation that had probably worked on Haley, on the other women he'd victimized. But I wasn't a frightened woman who'd been systematically broken down over months of abuse. I was a man who'd spent 25 years learning how to handle threats to the people I was sworn to protect. "That's where you're wrong, Martin. I know exactly what kind of man you are. I know about Sarah Chen. I know about the restraining orders. I know about the pattern of abuse that follows you wherever you go." His eyes narrowed, and I could see him reassessing the situation. The confident predator was being replaced by something more desperate, more dangerous. "You've been investigating me. You think you're some kind of detective now? I think I'm a father who's tired of watching his daughter suffer because of a coward who gets off on hurting women." Martin's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Careful, old man. You're in no position to be making accusations. This is private property, and you're trespassing. I could call the police right now." I smiled, and I could see that my expression unsettled him more than my words had. "Go ahead. Call them. Tell them you're here to meet your wife so you can punish her for going to the doctor without your permission. Explain to them why you chose this particular location for your conversation." We stared at each other across the concrete floor, two men who understood exactly what was at stake. Martin was beginning to realize that he wasn't in control of the situation, that for the first time in his life he was facing someone who wasn't afraid of him. "What do you want, James?" "I want you to understand something very clearly. My daughter is done being your victim. She's done living in fear, done making excuses for your behavior, done believing that she deserves to be treated like a punching bag. And if I don't agree with your assessment..." I took one final step forward, close enough now that Martin had to crane his neck slightly to look up at me. Close enough that he could see the absolute certainty in my eyes. "Then you and I are going to have a different kind of conversation. The kind that helps you understand exactly what happens to predators who make the mistake of hunting in my family." Martin's breathing was getting faster now, shallow and quick. He was finally beginning to understand that he wasn't the apex predator in this situation. For the first time in his adult life, he was facing someone who was bigger, stronger, and more dangerous than he was. Someone who had absolutely nothing to lose. "You're threatening me? You think you can intimidate me like I'm some kind of victim? I'm not threatening you, Martin. I'm explaining reality to you. You have two choices tonight. You can walk away from my daughter's life permanently, disappear so completely that she never has to worry about seeing you again. Or you can try to continue being the man you've been and discover what happens when someone fights back. The warehouse fell silent except for the sound of our breathing and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. Martin was staring at me, trying to read my expression, trying to determine if I was bluffing. I wasn't bluffing. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, each of us waiting for the other to make the first move. Martin's eyes were darting around the warehouse now, looking for escape routes, calculating his options. But I'd been in this building for over an hour. I knew every exit, every hiding spot, every advantage the terrain offered. There were none that would help him. "You're making a mistake, old man," Martin said, his voice trying to project confidence but failing to hide the tremor underneath. "You think you're protecting Haley, but you're just making things worse for her. When this is over, when you're gone, she'll still be my wife, and she'll pay for whatever happens here tonight." That was the moment I knew there would be no reasoning with him, no peaceful resolution. Martin had just threatened to take out his humiliation on my daughter, had made it clear that even if I let him walk away tonight, Haley would suffer the consequences of my intervention. He'd sealed his own fate. "You just made your choice for me," I said quietly. Martin must have seen something change in my expression because he suddenly lunged to his right, trying to reach the broken window I'd noted during my reconnaissance. He was fast for an accountant, but I'd been moving through hostile territory before he was born. I caught him before he made it halfway to the window, grabbing the back of his shirt and spinning him around to face me. His eyes were wide with genuine fear now, the predator finally understanding what it felt like to be prey. "Please," he gasped, stumbling backward until his shoulders hit the concrete wall. "I never meant to hurt her. It just got out of hand sometimes. I can change. I can get help." "You had 8 months to get help, Martin. 8 months while you were breaking my daughter's ribs, leaving bruises on her arms, making her afraid to speak without your permission." I grabbed the front of his shirt with both hands and lifted him slightly off the ground, pressing him against the wall. At 61, I wasn't as strong as I'd been in my 20s, but 25 years of military discipline and manual labor had kept me in better shape than most men my age. More importantly, those same 25 years had taught me exactly how to use whatever strength I had most effectively. "You want to know what it feels like, Martin? You want to understand what you've been putting my daughter through?" I released his shirt and stepped back, giving him just enough space to think he might have a chance. Martin immediately tried to run again, this time toward the main entrance. I let him get almost to the doorway before I caught him again, this time with a tackle that sent both of us crashing to the concrete floor. Martin tried to fight back, throwing wild punches that showed he'd never been in a real fight in his life. I caught his wrist on the second swing, applying just enough pressure to make him understand how helpless he was. "This is what Haley felt like every time you grabbed her," I said, maintaining the pressure until he cried out. "Helpless, scared, completely at the mercy of someone bigger and stronger." I released his wrist and stood up, looking down at him as he cradled his arm against his chest. There were tears in his eyes now, the same kind of tears I'd seen in Haley's eyes too many times over the past few months. "Please, James, I'm sorry. I know I made mistakes, but I love Haley. I never meant for things to go this far." "Love?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You don't love my daughter, Martin. You love controlling her. You love having someone smaller and weaker than you to take your frustrations out on." Martin was scrambling backward across the concrete floor now, trying to put distance between us. "I can change. I swear to you I can be better. Just give me another chance." "How many chances did you give Haley when she begged you to stop hitting her?" He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. We both knew the answer. I walked over to where he was cowering against a stack of old pallets, moving slowly, deliberately. Not because I was tired or winded, but because I wanted him to feel the anticipation, the fear of not knowing when the next blow would come. "Stand up, Martin." He shook his head, still crying. "I can't. I think you broke something." "I haven't broken anything yet. But the night is young." When he still didn't move, I reached down and hauled him to his feet by his shirt collar. He was lighter than I'd expected, probably no more than 160 pounds. No wonder he'd chosen to prey on women who were even smaller than he was. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, backing him against the concrete wall again. "You're going to disappear from my daughter's life, tonight. You're going to go home, pack whatever fits in your car, and drive as far away from Texas as you can get." "I can't just leave. I have a job, a lease, responsibilities." I grabbed his shirt again, lifting him until his feet were barely touching the ground. "Your responsibilities ended the first time you put your hands on my daughter. Everything else is just details." Martin was making choking sounds now, his hands clawing at my grip on his shirt. I loosened my hold just enough to let him breathe. "You're going to call Haley tomorrow and tell her the marriage is over. You're going to tell her it's your fault, that she deserves better, and that she'll never see you again. Are we clear?" He nodded frantically, gasping for air. "And if you ever come back to Texas, if you ever try to contact my daughter again, if I even hear a rumor that you're within 500 miles of her, we'll have another conversation. One that won't end with you walking away." I released him and stepped back. Martin collapsed to his knees, coughing and rubbing his throat. "Do you understand what I'm telling you, Martin?" "Yes," he whispered. "I understand." "I don't think you do." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the file Danny had compiled on Martin's history. I dropped it on the concrete floor in front of him, the pages scattering in the dim light. "This is everything I know about you. Every woman you've hurt, every restraining order, every time you've used your fists to solve problems that required a man instead of a coward." Martin stared at the papers, his face going pale as he recognized names, dates, incidents he'd probably convinced himself no one else remembered. "Sarah Chen is living in Oregon now, working as a nurse, still afraid to come back to Texas because she thinks you might find her. The other women you terrorized have scattered across the country, all of them carrying scars you gave them." I crouched down so I was at eye level with him. "But here's the thing about bullies, Martin. Eventually they pick on the wrong person. Eventually they go after someone whose family doesn't run away." Martin was shaking now, his whole body trembling with fear and adrenaline. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to know that if you ever hurt another woman the way you hurt my daughter, I will find out about it. And when I do, I won't be as generous as I'm being tonight." I stood up and walked over to where my jacket was hanging on a broken piece of machinery. From the inside pocket, I pulled out a small digital recorder and held it up so Martin could see it clearly. "This entire conversation has been recorded, Martin. Every threat you made against Haley, every admission of abuse, every word that proves you're exactly the kind of man I know you are." His eyes widened with horror. "You can't use that. It's illegal to record someone without their consent." "Is it? Well, I guess that's something for the lawyers to figure out. Of course, by the time any legal proceedings get started, copies of this recording will have found their way to your employer, your landlord, your neighbors, maybe even some of those women you thought would stay quiet forever." I put the recorder back in my pocket, watching as the implications sank in. "Unless, of course, you follow my instructions exactly. Disappear from Haley's life, leave the state, and never hurt another woman again. Do that and this recording stays locked in my safe. Insurance against you making any more mistakes." Martin struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against the wall. His face was a mess of tears, snot, and genuine terror. For the first time in his adult life, he was experiencing the helplessness he'd inflicted on others. "I'll go," he whispered. "Tonight. I'll pack my things and leave tonight." "Smart choice." I walked toward the warehouse entrance, then turned back to look at him one final time. "Martin, the women you hurt before my daughter, they were alone. They had no one to stand up for them, no one to make sure you faced consequences for your actions. That's the only reason you got away with it for so long." I stepped closer and he pressed himself back against the wall. "But Haley isn't alone. She has me. And if you ever forget that, if you ever think enough time has passed that it's safe to come back, remember this night. Remember how it felt to be helpless. Remember how it felt to be afraid." I left him there in the darkness, collapsed against the concrete wall, finally understanding what it meant to be the victim instead of the predator. As I walked back to my truck, I felt a weight lifting from my chest that I'd been carrying for months. My daughter was free, and Martin would never hurt her or anyone else ever again. I drove home through empty streets, my hands steady on the steering wheel, my mind clearer than it had been in months. The clock on my dashboard read 11:43, and I knew Haley would be waiting up for me, probably pacing the floor of my living room, worried about what had happened at the warehouse. She was exactly where I'd expected to find her, curled up on my old leather couch with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. She looked up when I walked through the front door, her eyes searching my face for answers. "Dad, are you okay? You're not hurt, are you?" I sat down beside her, suddenly feeling every one of my 61 years. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Everything went exactly as planned." "What about Martin? Where is he?" "Martin is packing his belongings. By morning he'll be on his way out of Texas, and he won't be coming back." Haley stared at me for a long moment, her expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been hope. "What did you do to him?" I explained the situation to him in terms he could understand. He's decided that leaving town permanently is in his best interest. She was quiet for several minutes, processing what I'd told her. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Is it really over? Is he really going to leave me alone?" I reached over and took her hands in mine. They were still shaking slightly, but not with fear this time. "It's over, Haley. Martin will never hurt you again. I promise you that." The tears came then, not the terrified sobs I'd heard so many times over the past few months, but tears of relief. She collapsed against my shoulder, and I held her the way I used to when she was little and had nightmares. "I was so scared, Dad. Not just of him, but of what would happen if I tried to leave. He made me believe that no one would help me, that everyone would think it was my fault. None of this was your fault, sweetheart. Not one single bit of it. But I stayed. Even after he started hitting me, I stayed. What kind of person does that make me?" I pulled back so I could look at her face, making sure she could see the absolute conviction in my eyes. "It makes you human. It makes you someone who wanted to believe that the person you married was capable of change, capable of love. There's nothing wrong with that hope, Haley. The problem was never with you." We sat together in the quiet comfort of my living room, and for the first time in months I could see my real daughter starting to emerge from behind the shell of fear Martin had built around her. The phone call came the next morning at exactly 9 o'clock. Haley was in my kitchen making breakfast when her cell phone rang. She looked at the caller ID and went pale. "It's Martin." "Answer it," I said, moving to stand beside her. "But put it on speaker." Her hand shook as she accepted the call. "Haley." Martin's voice was hoarse, strained, nothing like the confident predator who'd walked into that warehouse 12 hours earlier. "I'm here. I'm calling to tell you that our marriage is over. I'm leaving Texas today, and I won't be coming back." There was a long pause. I could see Haley struggling to find words, to process the fact that her nightmare was actually ending. "I don't understand. What happened last night? Where did you go after you left the house?" "That doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that you deserve better than what I've given you. You deserve someone who treats you the way you should be treated." Another pause. Martin's voice cracked slightly when he continued. "I'm sorry, Haley, for everything. For the way I treated you, for the things I said, for making you afraid in your own home. You didn't deserve any of it." I could see the confusion in my daughter's eyes. This wasn't the Martin she'd been living with, the man who never apologized, who always found ways to make his abuse her fault. "Martin, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Just know that you're free. You can go back to being the person you were before you met me. You can call your friends again, visit your father whenever you want, make decisions without asking permission. You can live your life." "Where will you go?" "Far away. Somewhere I can't hurt you anymore. Goodbye, Haley." The line went dead. Haley stared at her phone for a long moment before setting it down on the kitchen counter. "He's really gone. He's really gone." 3 weeks later, I was in my workshop sanding the final coat of varnish on a rocking chair when Haley walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression I hadn't seen in over a year. She was smiling. Really smiling, not the careful, forced expression she'd worn around Martin, but the genuine, radiant smile that had been missing from her face for so long. "I got a call from the school district today," she said, settling into the old chair I kept in the corner for visitors. "They offered me the position teaching 4th grade at Riverside Elementary, the one I applied for 6 months ago." "That's wonderful, sweetheart. When do you start?" "Next Monday." The previous teacher had to leave suddenly due to family circumstances. She paused, taking a sip of her coffee. Dad, Martin used to tell me I wasn't smart enough to handle a full classroom by myself. He said the only reason I got hired as a substitute was because they were desperate. I set down my sandpaper and looked at her directly. And what do you think now? I think he was wrong about a lot of things. That afternoon, Haley asked me to drive with her to the house she'd shared with Martin. The landlord had called to say that Martin had broken his lease and disappeared, leaving behind most of his belongings and a month's rent to cover the early termination. I need to get my things, she explained as we pulled into the driveway. My books, my teaching supplies, the photos of Mom. The house felt different now, smaller somehow, less threatening. Martin's presence had been erased so completely it was hard to believe he'd ever lived there at all. His clothes were gone from the closets, his toiletries removed from the bathroom, his controlling influence lifted from every room. In the bedroom, Haley packed her belongings methodically, carefully folding each item as if she were packing for a long journey rather than just moving back home temporarily, which in a way she was. This was the beginning of a new life, one where she wouldn't have to ask permission to visit her father or apologize for having her own opinions. Dad. She was holding a framed photo of her and Martin from their wedding day, both of them smiling at the camera. What should I do with this? I looked at the photo, at the man I'd confronted in that warehouse, at my daughter when she still believed in fairy tales and happy endings. What do you want to do with it? She stared at the picture for a long moment, then walked to the kitchen trash can and dropped it inside. I want to remember who I was before I met him, not who I became when I was with him. 6 months later, Haley had found her own apartment, a bright, cheerful place with big windows and space for the art supplies she'd stopped using during her marriage. She was thriving in her new teaching position, had reconnected with friends she'd lost touch with, and was slowly rebuilding the confidence Martin had systematically destroyed. We were having dinner at my house when she brought up the subject I'd been wondering if she'd ever ask about. Dad, what really happened that night at the warehouse? I'd been prepared for this question for months, had thought carefully about how to answer it. I had a conversation with Martin about the consequences of his actions. He decided that leaving town was his best option. That's all? That's all that matters. She studied my face for a moment, then nodded. I don't need to know the details. I just need to know that it's really over. It's really over, sweetheart. Good. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Because I have some news. I've been seeing someone. My protective instincts immediately kicked in. Oh? Tell me about him. His name is David, and he's a teacher at the middle school. He's kind, patient, and he makes me laugh. Real laughter, not the nervous kind I used to do around Martin. I could see the happiness in her eyes, the natural glow that came from being with someone who appreciated her rather than diminished her. And the most important thing about David, she continued, is that he reminds me every day that I have value, that my thoughts and opinions matter, that I deserve to be treated with respect. That's how it should be. I know that now. I might have forgotten it for a while, but you reminded me who I really am. You saved me, Dad. I shook my head. I just gave you back the strength you already had. You saved yourself, Haley. You found the courage to call me that night, to trust me with the truth. That took more bravery than anything I did. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the choices we make when the people we love are in danger. Some people call the police, some hire lawyers, some try to work within systems that don't always protect the innocent. Sometimes, though, the only language a predator understands is force. Sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to show him what it feels like to be afraid. I'd made my choice that night at the warehouse, and I'd do it again without hesitation. Because Martin was gone, Haley was safe, and justice had been served in the most direct way possible. My daughter was free, and that was worth everything.